Genesis chapter 8. Genesis chapter 8 is one of the first places that we find talk of a covenant. And here, beginning in verse 20, this is after the flood and the waters have subsided. They get out. Verse 19, every beast, every creeping thing, every bird, everything that moves on the earth went out by families from the ark. Verse 20, then Noah built an altar to the Lord and took some of every clean animal and some of the very clean bird and offered burnt offerings on the altar. So here we have offering, we have death, we have sacrifice. When the Lord smelled the pleasing aroma, the Lord said in his heart, I will never again curse the ground because of man, for the intention of man's heart is evil from his youth. Neither will I ever strike down every living creature as I've done. While the earth remains, seedtime and harvest, cold and heat, summer and winter, day and night shall not cease. And then God blesses Noah and his sons and says to them, be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth. The fear of you and the dread of you shall be upon every beast of the earth, upon every bird of the heavens, upon everything that creeps on the ground, all the fish of the sea. Into your hand they are delivered. Every moving thing that lives shall be food for you, and as I gave you the green plants, I give you everything. But you shall not eat flesh with its life, that is its blood. And for your lifeblood I will require a reckoning. From every beast I will require from man. From his fellow man I will require a reckoning for the life of man. Whoever sheds the blood of man, by man shall his blood be shed. For God made man his own image. Obviously harking back to Genesis 1. And you be fruitful and multiply. Teem on the earth, multiply it. And that's, again, going back to Genesis 1. In Genesis chapter 6, verse 18, we find the very first mention of this covenant. Okay? God says to Noah, I will establish my covenant with you. Okay? And you shall come into the ark, you, your sons, your wife, your sons' wives with you. And so the first mention in Scripture, the word covenant, is used almost as a promise. We find with Noah, as God gives commands to Noah and then God promises to bless him, there's some sort of original intent in creation that is hearkened back to. I made mention of obviously going back to Genesis 1, be fruitful and multiply, image bearing. We find too that here that the creation mandate will never again be interrupted by a suspension of the natural order, at least through flood. God promises that. Interestingly, in verse 16, when God speaks more of this covenant, verse 8, well, we could begin in chapter 9, verse 8. Then God said to Noah and his sons, behold, I establish my covenant with you and your offspring after you, with every living creature. I establish my covenant, verse 11, with you, that never again shall all flesh be cut off by the waters of the flood. Never again shall there be a flood to destroy the earth. Verse 12, this is the sign of the covenant. I've set my bow in the cloud. Verse 13. Verse 15, when God sees it, I will remember my covenant that is between me and you and every living creature of all flesh. Verse 16, when the bow is in the clouds, I will see it and remember the everlasting covenant between God and every living creature of all flesh that is on the earth. This is the sign of the covenant I have established between me and all flesh that's on the earth. Noah is the recipient of this. He's almost acting, not entirely, but almost acting in a priestly role, as he's not exactly the mediator of this, but he's at least the person who's hearing it, who will then pass it on down. And interestingly enough, again, sacrifices are made. So there's Noah, this everlasting covenant. Everlasting covenant. Which I take it means it's still going. Whenever we see a rainbow in the sky, we ought to, of all people, remember what it represents, that God made a promise. That's a sign of God's faithfulness, or a sign of God's promise faithfulness. Genesis 12, the Abrahamic covenant. Again, the covenants, I think, are the superstructure of redemptive history. It's all of the flesh and sinew and muscle hang on this. And if that's the case, then the Abrahamic covenant is the most significant of them. The gospel makes sense, I think, in light of the Abrahamic covenant. So Genesis 12, 15, and 17. And I think you're familiar with it, so I'm just going to highlight a few things here for you. This is, I think what we find in 12, 15, and 17 is one covenant given in stages that are reflective of Abraham's spiritual pilgrimage. It's kind of developed over time. And part of that could be a literary device as well, but that seems to be what's going on. As he's given a promise, it's kind of bare bones, minimal. Leave, I will bless you, I will make you into a name, a nation. All nations will be blessed through you. And then more is given in 15, and then more detail even so in chapter 17. There appears to be, in chapters 15 and 17, different emphases over the seed of Abraham. Later on, I think Paul's going to take advantage of that. It's not a mistake. Okay, I'm not saying that. But Paul is going to use seed in the singular way, even though it's what's the right term for that? It's a corporate singular. It's I think that's the right term. I could be mistaken on that. Okay. In chapter 15 and 17, there's a promise of a seed, and it appears there's different emphases in chapters 15 and chapter 17. So it's not the same things being said there. And we could, I don't want to take the time to unpack it. All I will say is that if you look at it, Paul, I think, is going to take advantage of that difference in emphases, or emphasis. There's sacrifice also, we find in this Abrahamic covenant. We get this very odd thing in chapter 15 where God promises Abram at the time, what he will do for him and what Abram will be, a promise to return to the land when the iniquity of the Amorites is complete. And then verse 17 is this odd scene. When the sun had gone down and it was dark, behold, a smoking firepot and a flaming torch passed between these pieces. On that day the Lord made a covenant with Abram, saying, to your offspring I give this land, from the river of Egypt to the great river, the river Euphrates, then the land of all these different people groups. And so we get this very bizarre thing, but I take it in the ancient Near East that there would have been something that made sense about that in how the treaty was cut. I think that's even where the phrase cut a treaty comes from, that you sacrifice an animal, the parties walk between it. The implication is, so be it, so may it be done to me as was done to these animals if I do not live up to the obligations of the covenant. And what's interesting here is it's only God who walks through it. So that here's this unconditionality of God's promise. He's going to do this with Abram. And so that's in chapter 15. Chapter 17, there's a sign of the covenant that is given to Abraham, circumcision. Now, most of the time when we're talking about the Abrahamic covenant, we tend to think of it as a unilateral covenant. But as I read in chapter 17, there are obligations that are placed upon Abram, or Abraham, I guess, in chapter 17. Abraham and his offspring. There are ethical demands made, and there's a sign of the covenant given to them. The language in chapter 15 focuses on a nation and the land. A nation and the land. That's a big deal there. And it really, this covenant language of chapter 15 becomes the answer to questions of exactly why God could order the Israelites to come in and commit what for all the world looks like genocide. It lays a foundation for Israel's claim when they re-enter the land. In chapter 17, though, rather than just a nation, there's a kingly bent to it. Here, it's not just nations, but it's nation and kings. So leaders are promised. That might have been implicit, but here it's made explicit. What's the content of this? Well, and I get this, the book is Progressive Dispensationalism by Blazing and Box. That's what the PD stands for there. I think they do a really good job of unpacking the covenants, and so I'd recommend that, even for those of you who aren't necessarily dispensationalists, or progressive dispensationalists for that matter. They do a really good job of walking through the covenants and looking at the linkages between them. Here they are. God is going to bless Abraham. That's what we find there. Abraham's going to mediate God's blessings to others, and so there's a priestly role attached, a priestly promise, if you will. But also, Abraham's going to mediate God's curse as well. And that would be an interesting theme to develop, exactly how the seed of Abraham mediates God's curse. And of course, our mind ought to instantly go to Jesus, to whom the keys of judgment are given to. Abraham will become a great nation in chapter 12, and then again in chapter 18, that promise is made. God is going to give to Abraham and his descendants the land of Canaan. Abraham's going to have many descendants. That's obviously a significant aspect of the promise. What else do I want to say about that? This covenant will be established with Abraham's descendants, so it's not just a one-time shot. It's going to be redone over and over again. God's going to be the God of Abraham and his descendants, and they would be his people. And so there's a theme, this kind of covenantal blessing that's going to be repeated over and over again. And I will be your God, you will be my people. I will be your God, you will be my people. And then, ultimately, I will dwell in the midst of you. Comes into this as well. So, some observations on the Abraham covenant. One, it affects the affairs of nations. There seems to be this promise entailed is that Israel, in some shape or form, will endure. And that's obviously going to be necessary if David's going to have an eternal throne promised to him. Now, how Israel endures, that's another question. But there is a promise that Israel will endure. The blessings of nations will be like the blessings that are promised to Israel. So, and now what do I mean by this? All the nations of the world will be blessed through you. Okay? What does that blessing look like? I take it that whatever the blessings that are promised to Israel are, that they are in turn going to mediate those blessings to the rest of the nations. These blessings as given, and we did not read all of the Abrahamic texts, they are holistic in form. The blessings are holistic. I suppose if you were going to preach a prosperity gospel message, you'd go to Abrahamic covenant. You'd go to Deuteronomy chapter 28, Mosaic covenant things. How did you know that you were receiving the blessing of God? You got stuff, you know. You got your wine vats were overflowing. Your barns were full. You had peace with your enemies. Or you didn't have enemies, I guess, or the enemies you did have were subjugated and weren't threatening you. Health is promised. All sorts of things. And I'm bleeding into Mosaic covenant terms as well. Religious blessing, though, is also critical. So here, there's spiritual blessing that's inferred, and this is going to lead to the explicit contingencies of the Mosaic Code. So there's holistic blessing, I'm going to dwell in the land, but there's a relationship with God, a relationship that is not, by nature, you're an object of my wrath, sort of thing. The principle of mediation is introduced as well. Abraham is going to mediate blessing to the people. or Abraham's seed is anyway. And it strikes me that, especially as I read the book of Galatians, that Paul saw this as the covenant of which he was the torchbearer. Right? He saw what he was doing in taking the gospel to the nations as the fulfillment of mediating the blessings to the nations as he took the gospel of Christ. That people could become true offspring of Abraham through faith in Christ. And so, as Paul argues, especially in the book of Galatians, and I recognize there's an occasionality to every letter that Paul wrote, but Paul sees the Abrahamic covenant as superior to the Mosaic covenant. And that Jesus comes, yes, Jesus came in fulfillment of the law. He wouldn't have denied that, but that from the very beginning there was a promise made that all the nations would be blessed through Abraham, and Jesus makes sense in light of that. He's the fulfillment of that. And so then as Paul goes carrying the gospel, he becomes, borrowing the language of Isaiah, spoken of the Messiah, he becomes a light to the nations. The importance of the Abrahamic covenant in Pauline theology cannot be overstated. Comments on Abraham? If you,
one question.
Yeah.
In 17 verses 3 and on, there's like 4 or 5 times he says multitude of nations.
Yeah.
Which,
how many is a multitude?
Huh?
How many is a multitude?
Well, it's definitely more than one.
Yeah.
You know, and he says through Isaac your seed will be called.
Yeah.
So,
well, I don't
think you can really count the ones that came from Esau and all of that.
Well, perhaps you can. He says, "Behold, my covenant with you used to be the father of multitude of nations. No longer shall your name be called Abram, but your name be Abraham. I've made you father. I will make you exceedingly fruitful, and I will make you into nations, and kings shall come from you. I will make you." That language of fruitful. It seems to me that the answer to who are these nations, are the different offspring that he had, although Isaac becomes that one and only son. And so you have a multitude of nations, but you have almost only begotten kinds of pride of place, child of promise given to Isaac. So I've always understood the multitude of nations and kings coming from him, not just a bunch of kings in the Israelite line, but literally nations being born out of him. Is that?
Would there be more unity between the Abrahamic covenant and the Mosaic covenant than what? Because sometimes when I talk about it, it's like they're two unrelated.
Yeah.
Like there's so much discontinuity between it. And I don't know if that's Old Covenant, New Covenant kind of.
No. Well, see, as I see it, the foundation. The foundation is laid in the Abrahamic covenant, and we'll talk about this more next week. The foundation is laid in the Abrahamic covenant, and so when the Mosaic covenant comes along, it makes sense. It flows out of it. They're not the same precise thing, but even as I think I said here that what was the language that I used? The contingencies of the Mosaic code are going to rise out of, really, I think, some of the stipulations that we find in Genesis 17. So even now, part of it makes sense. I think there's a lot more continuity between the Abrahamic covenant and the Mosaic covenant than what we might think. Does that keep going?
Well, I'm just thinking, but then how do you talk about, when we speak of the Old Covenant, New Covenant, are we speaking more in terms of the Mosaic Covenant, or what references does the Old Covenant have? What ties does it have?
No, I think typically I think when Paul talks about the Old Covenant, especially like in 2 Corinthians 3, he's talking about the Mosaic Covenant. He's talking about the law of Moses, right? And yet in Galatians, Paul knows there's an older covenant that is greater than, because it contains, and not to say the Mosaic Covenant didn't, but certainly not as explicitly, and it wasn't central, like what we find the promise of a gospel flowing right out of the promises made to Abraham. Yeah, Dave.
It seems that as Scripture unfolds, that the Mosaic Covenant, as you said, flows out of the Abrahamic, because all the God's deliverance of Israel out of Egypt is rooted and grounded in the Abrahamic covenant.
In those promises made.
On the basis of that promise, and then establishes the theocracy through the Mosaic covenant as his redeemed people.
Yeah, and which I think is why over and over, I mean, even when God appears to God appears to Moses, he identifies himself as, I am the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Remember that with Isaac and Jacob, we won't go into this, the promise was reiterated to both of them. That promise I made to your dad, I'm making to you. That promise I made to your grandpa and your dad, I'm making to you. Okay, so you're the recipient of it. And so then when Moses shows up, God calls him to lead his people out of Exodus. Actually, not just his people, his sons. Take my sons. He identifies himself as the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. I don't think that's like God's name. I don't think he's merely identifying himself. Oh yeah, that God. No, it's I'm the God who made the specific promise, and now I am raising you up and calling you to deliver my people because I made a promise to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob.